In this video, we'll build a realistic window shader. For this, we'll first set up a simple base shader, then add some interesting distortions to our reflections, and finally create some subtle dirt effects for the final result. So this is how most people would set up a simple window shader for example, a high-rise building. But I will show you that with a few of simple tricks, you can immediately get a much nicer and more realistic result. You can see we have the accurate distortions here on the glass. We have some kind of dirt effects here on the window. And we have some irregularities and some randomizations here to make this overall just look much more authentic. So this one right here would be our starting point. As you can see, we just have this grayish diffuse material applied to our window front. So let's make this look a little bit more like glass. So first of all, let's bump up here the reflection all the way to white. You can see now we have some reflections which are showing up here on our window. And I want to have the window look a little bit like this kind of very mirrored window fronts of some skyscraper buildings where you can't really see the inside of our building. So let's just use here a metalness of 1 and then just give this a diffuse color of this kind of like bluish greenish color tint so that we get the impression of this very reflective window front of high-rise buildings. So now we can slowly reduce the metalness because you can see if I go down with the metalness, we have now some kind of shadow which appears here on our window. And for a perfect glass, you wouldn't really get this kind of shadow. But in this case, we have a very large scale window front and it appears a little bit like there's some dust or some kind of dirt or something like this layered on top of our windows. So I think not having the metalness set to a perfect value of 1 might do us some favor in this case. So let's slowly increase the metalness to, for example, something like 0.75. So we still get a little bit the feeling of a shadow in here. And this, in my opinion, looks more realistic than if we have the metalness here set to complete 1, where you don't really get any kind of shadow or light interaction with our window front. So in shading, if there's some specific effect you try to achieve, like here, the feeling that there's some kind of small dust here layered on top of our glass, don't be afraid to break some physical rules of the shaders, because in the end, only the end result is what matters. And if that's the easiest way to get this kind of feeling, then it's completely fine to dial those settings in there, just as long as you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So at the moment, this window front here looks too perfect. So let's try to change that up and add some randomizations in that. And the easiest way to do it is, for example, here with a vray multi-subtexture. We're gonna leave all of these settings here at the default and just connect this into the diffuse slot of the material. You can see at the moment we don't really have the result that we want because we have to choose here the random operator and then just go by the element. Because all of our windows here are separate elements, we can add different kind of brightness values here on our individual window patches. And now it's just a matter of dialing in the correct opacity. So let's reduce this here, something like 25. You can see now our original color here starts to show through. In our case, let's just use a very subtle value of 5. So you can see we have some windows which are a little bit brighter, some which are a little bit darker. And I think this just makes it look overall more realistic and breaks up this large and boring surface a little bit. So this one here would be the model that I use for this window front. You can see it consists out of 2 parts. We have these frames and then we have these windows in here. And now I want to take care about the distortions on the window. And for this, I think it's a good idea to just assign some UVs. And you can see we have all the windows, which are separate elements in here, or separate faces. And in order to get a very simple UV map here for each of those windows, we can just apply here a new UVW map modifier and then just set this here to the face option. So basically every face here will have a UV map assigned to it, and we can use that in order to add some details here on our windows. So what oftentimes tends to happen with those windows is that since they're only attached here to the frame, and they're quite a large surface, they either tend to bulge inwards or outwards. And this effect we try to replicate now with a simple bump map. So for this, let's just add here a simple vray bump material. So we can use all of our bump map in this separate material and just connect here our glass as the base material, and then deal with all of the bump mapping in this separate material. So first of all, let's increase the bump amount here to a value of 100, because now we're gonna add a vray color to bump node in here. And if this bump amount is not 100, then here our height doesn't really translate correctly. And then inside here, we're just gonna put a new composite map, and then in this composite we can then layer different layers on top of each other in order to get our finished bump map. So now in our color to bump, let's just increase our height for now to some very high value, like 50 centimeters, so that we will clearly see what we're doing exactly. And then inside our composite, let's just add a simple gradient ramp inside. And then inside the gradient, you can see there's some distortions already happening, but we don't want to have a linear gradient. We want to have here a radial gradient. And once we do this, you can see we get some kind of effect here already. Let's just remove here the center point, and let's reduce the tiling to something like 0.4. And you can see we have this kind of pinch here in the center. This we can improve by just choosing here the ease in interpolation type. And you can see now this pinch is not very visible anymore. We can even play here with the curves a little bit to get, for example, some kind of effect that we're looking for. And at the moment here, those windows, they would be bulging inwards. And if we just invert this one, then they would bulge outwards. So now we want to, of course, randomize this effect by just having some of those windows bulging outwards, some of them bulging inwards, and some of them are not bulging at all. And this we can easily do with a vray multi-subtexture again. Let's just switch this one here to random. And let's give this all here this mid gray value. And let's just use, for example, 3 slots for now. And let's connect here our bulging outwards into the first slot. Then we're gonna copy this one here and just invert this again. So this one would be the bulging inwards. Connect this here into the second slot. And then the third slot, we're just gonna leave it like this with this gray color value inside here. And now if we connect this here into our first layer of our composite, you can see that nothing happens. And that's because I forgot here to enable the by element option. So once we do this, you can see that some of those windows now are bulging outwards. Some of them are bulging inwards, and some of them don't have any bulging at all. So if we even wanted to randomize this further, we could add, for example, 2 more slots, also give them this kind of mid-gray color value inside. Let's just connect here the bulge outwards and then the bulge inwards again. And now instead of 100%, we're just going to use a value of 50% here. And then it's going to blend this map with this color value inside. And then we have some of the windows which are bulging much less than they were before. So now I went inside and cleaned up the node graph a little bit so that we have more room to add our next effect. And that's going to be some additional noise for every window here in order to further break up our shapes. So for this, let's go into our composite. Let's just add a new layer. And inside here, we're just going to add a simple noise map for 3ds Max. And now you can see we have some noise here showing up on our window. So let's go inside our noise and customize this. Let's just choose here fractal, for example, and then maybe 1.5 levels. And then we have more variation in the noise, but we have one issue. And as you can see here, for example, the noise just continues through our windows. So we don't really have a unique pattern for each of our windows. We just have this continuous noise pattern going through all of our windows. And I want to randomize this here, of course. So instead of using the object XYZ, let's switch this one here to explicit map channel. Let's choose a size of 1, for example. So you can see we have some noise here now showing up on our windows. But we have now the problem that each of our windows uses exactly the same noise pattern. This we want to randomize, of course. So let's move this one into here and let's add a simple vray triplanar texture put this in between and connect here the noise into the texture and then the output into our second layer of our composite map. And now let's go up and increase the size here to, for example, 100. You can see we have the same issue again. So we have the pattern which basically goes through each of our windows without breaking on the edges. But now luckily in our triplanar texture, we have the option to randomize the texture offset. And then we're going to do this by using the elements. So every element will have a random offset. And we have this nice noise pattern now on every window, which is breaking here on each window and not continuing over into the next windows. So now let's move to our composite and let's combine both effects, because at the moment we just have this normal mode and the opacity of 100. So we're completely ignoring here our first layer. So let's change that. Let's switch this one here to overlay, for example. And now we're combining our noise with our bulging together. We can get a much nicer effect in here. So now in the color to bump, you can define a different height. If you feel this one here is too strong, let's use, for example, a value of 20. Like this, we have much less distortion here going on. And depending on the type of building and window, you want to choose different height values, or you can make this extremely subtle, for example, like here, where you still get kind of very clear reflections, but you have this slight breakup here on the edges. In our case, let's just increase this slightly to, for example, 12.5 to get a bit stronger effect going on, because I think this makes it look much nicer in this case in here. So now we have some nice looking distortions already, which looks already much more realistic, but our windows themselves, they still look too clean and too perfect. And the reason for that is that we don't really have any kind of dirt effects in here. So in reality, no surface is ever as pristine as this in here, especially for some large scale structures. There would always be some kind of dirt accumulating here in the corners, for example, or on the surface. And that's exactly what we try to add now. So I prepared already this simple material here. You can see it just has this kind of like dark diffuse color with a little bit of blurry reflections. And this we're going to be using as the dirt here to add to our windows. So what we have to do is to use a V-Ray blend material to add the dirt on top of our base material in here. So let's create a new V-Ray blend material. Let's just place that into here. Let's connect our base shader into the base material of the V-Ray blend material, and then our dirt into the first coat in here. And then we're gonna connect the output into here our bump material. And now you can see something change, because now we're adding here the dirt on top. And at the moment it just uses this color value in here. So if I choose a factor of 0, then basically we just only show our base shader. And if I have this here to complete white, then we only use here our dirt. So let's put this here to black, because we're gonna use a mask in order to place this dirt on top of our window. But before we do that, let's just put here the diffuse color to some very strong color, for example, this reddish color, so that we can easily see where we're gonna place our dirt effects. So for our blend amount, let's use composite, and let's move this a bit out of the way. And for the first layer, let's just add a V-Ray bitmap, and let's just load this dirt texture inside here. And then in the V-Ray bitmap, we can, for example, try to invert this to see what kind of effect we're getting. I think like this might be better already. Let's use a triplanar texture and use, for example, a scaling of 100 or 200 to get some kind of dirt which is layered on top of here now. In the V-Ray bitmap, we can decrease the tiling for the V. So let's use, for example, a tiling of 0.1. And like this, we will get more this kind of streaky effect here going on. So now in our composite, I think we can reduce here the opacity a little bit. So let's just put a new V-Ray color and put this one to black. And then let's just place that below our streaky effect here. And let's just give this an opacity of 25%, for example. So we have it a little bit more subtle. So now I want to go in and increase the effect here on the edges of each window. And for this, let's go in and add another new layer. We're going to just instance here our streaky effect in this layer. And here we're gonna just place a simple mask. So let's just put here a gradient ramp. Let's just move this down a little bit, enlarge it so we can see what this is. Let's just switch this here to the box type. And now you can see if I just put this one here to black and I just move this over a little bit, we will have the mask here much stronger on the edges. As you can see here in this small preview, it's masking out basically the borders of every window. We can go inside and just, for example, use the ease in interpolation type. And let's just play with the curves a little bit so that we get a little bit more what we are looking for. Let me just increase this here a little bit. You can see that we have now the effect here much stronger on each window frame. What we could also do is to go back to the composite and let's add another new layer. And then inside here, let's just add another gradient ramp. Let's put this one here to multiply. Let's move this over here and let's see how we can further customize this. You can see the overall streaks on the window. They are now fading out towards the bottom of each window. I think now we can just blend this a little bit better. For example, something like 75%. So we have them in general stronger here at the top and then weaker at the bottom. All right, so now I cleaned up the graph a little bit and now let's just remove this kind of reddish color, which was just for preview. Let's just give it this kind of like very dark brownish color here, for example, for the dirt. And you can see then it becomes much more subtle. So if we want to have this more visible, we can just add a new color correction map inside. And then let's just connect here our composite into the color correction. And then this one here in our blend material. And now we can just go in and, for example, boost here the RGB. And you can see that the effect now becomes much stronger. I'm not going to make it so strong because I think it's already a little bit overboard. You can also play with the contrast here. For example, you can, if you up the gamma, you can make it overall more visible. If you reduce the gamma, then it will just show up here on the edges. So there's a lots of different options that you can use to play with this. So now as a last step, let's just use here our dirt mask to drive the glossiness or roughness here of our glass base shader. Let's just go inside here and let's just connect here our composite into the glossiness of our base shader. Once we do this, you can see we have this extremely rough result now. That's because at the moment we use the glossiness, but here basically all the bright parts would be the rougher parts of our surface. So let's just switch this one here to use the roughness. And you can see once we do this, we have this kind of like roughness variation here on the windows. If we want to go in and blend this now, let's just put here the base roughness to 0. And then we can just go inside here and, for example, give this lower values like 50. So we have a much more subtle effect. So as said, depending on your use case, you might want to blend these effects in here very subtle to just get a little bit of feeling to enhance the realism. And it doesn't need to be as obvious as here because this one is just mainly for demonstration purposes. So there you have it. This one here would be our final result now. And we took care about the distortions on the window where we have these windows bulging inwards and outwards and have this kind of nice noise patterns here on top. We have some variation here on the surface itself where some windows, they reflect slightly darker compared to other windows. And we have this nice procedural dirt effects here on the windows, which overall help with making this feel a little bit more realistic and not as generic as to just have this perfectly reflecting surface without any irregularities or imperfections. So this kind of shader here is for this kind of like super reflective window fronts where you can't really see the interior of the buildings, because in this case I don't really have any interior. But if you have an interior, you have some rooms behind that you want to show, then of course you wouldn't use the metalness, what I did in my shader, but you would add some refractions so that you can actually look through the glass surface and see the rooms behind. But other than that, everything would work exactly the same. So you would build the same kind of distortions, the same kind of dirt effects, the same kind of variations. And you should get a very nice and realistic result. If you watch this content until here, chances are that you also are interested in the content that I provide over on my Patreon, where you can have access to all of my scene files, watch a whole course on car rendering, and get access to lots of other additional goodies, so check that out if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, see you next tutorial, take care, and see you soon.